Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Echoes of War panel. My name is Justin. I work at Chicago Public Library, and I will be moderating our session today. And today's books are a mix of fiction and nonfiction that are about resisting Nazism during World War II. And I am very pleased to be joined by Robert Edsel, author of Remember Us, published by HarperCollins, which is the nonfiction account of Dutch Limburg's grave adoption program, which watches over their fallen American liberators. Kristin Harmel, author of The Stolen Life of Colette Marceau by Gallery Books, Simon and Schuster, which is the fictional story of an octogenarian jewel thief whose present day remains tethered to her World War II upbringing. Lynne Olson, author of The Sisterhood of Ravensbruck by Penguin Random House, which is a nonfiction recounting of the female French resistance fighters who were imprisoned at Ravensbruck. And then also Morgan Ryan, who's the author of A Resistance of Witches by Viking and Penguin Random House, which is a fantasy novel about a witch's search for a magical item that may turn the tides of war. So thank you all so much for joining us. First off, I just want to hear a little bit more about your books. So Robert, I want to start with you. Can you tell me a little bit about the title of your book, Remember Us? What's the inspiration behind it?
Remember Us is taken from a remarkable poem by one of the great poets of the United States, Archibald MacLeish, who suffered losses during World War I. And it was an ode to all people to remember that freedom is not free, and it comes at a horrific cost. And it was an appeal for people to remember who these men and women were that lost their lives. And it was really encapsulated in this remarkable high watermark for humanity that took place in World War II. This story I've written about Remember Us is not a World War II story, but that's the backdrop. And at this moment at the end of the war, there were 17,800 American boys and a few women buried at the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten in Holland, in the Netherlands. And the local Dutch people there tried to find an answer to the question, how do you thank your liberators who got your freedom back when they're not alive to thank? And they came up with a remarkable and unique solution, which was a grave adoption program that not only cared for the memory of the men and women that are buried there today, but reached across the ocean into the houses to try and assuage the grief of the many families that had lost a loved one.
Thank you. And there were so many amazing stories that you tell within that. Moving on to our other nonfiction book, Lynne, in the Sisterhood of Ravensbruck, you write that compared to camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, which were liberated earlier in the war, the atrocities at Ravensbrück were significantly less documented. So can you tell us more about this camp and the women that were imprisoned there?
Yes, certainly. Ravensbrück was unique among all the German concentration camps during World War II. It was the only camp designed solely for women. More than 130,000 women from all over occupied Europe, most of them belonging to resistance organizations in their countries, were sent there. And more than 40,000 of those women died there. But today, as you mentioned, almost no one knows about Ravensbrück. And we do know about camps like Dachau and Buchenwald because they were liberated by American and British troops. And there were American journalists covering those troops who reported on the horror and ghastliness of what they saw at the camps. That was not true of Ravensbrück. It was liberated by Soviet troops. So there were no Western journalists there. And there are no photos, no film footage of piles of dead bodies and skeleton-like survivors like the other camps. So as a result, or partly as a result of that, history has really forgotten about this all-women's camp. It's forgotten the atrocities committed there, but it's also forgotten the courage of so many of the women who were sent there. And that's what my book is about. It's forgotten that in the middle of all this horror, a large number of women refused to behave like victims. Instead, they banded together to continue to resist the Nazis within the camp. So my story is specifically about a tight-knit group of high-spirited, audacious French women who formed a sisterhood in Ravensbruck. They were determined to help each other to survive, first of all. But they also were determined to stand up to the Nazis and then tell the world what had happened there. And that's exactly what they did.
And your book really is an incredible testament to them and their courage. Moving on to our fiction books, Kristin, The Stolen Life of Colette Marceau, it oscillates between World War II and 2018, and it tells the fictional tale of this octogenarian jewel thief who has a very curious family credo. What is the story behind her family profession?
Well, let me say, first of all, Justin, thank you so much for all the care you've put into these questions. I know they've been very thoughtful so far. I know we're going to have a great conversation today. And I also want to say how smart I think it is that you're doing fiction and nonfiction together, because I think they really complement each other. I think they're different ways into these stories of the past. And, just listening to Lynne particularly talk about things that my books have touched on in the past, but she's coming at it from a completely different direction, is really, really interesting to me. So thank you for hosting all four of us. As far as Colette Marceau of the title and her family profession, she has a long tradition of jewel theft in her family. But they believe themselves to be descendants of Robin Hood. And so in that spirit, they steal from the wealthy and unkind and redistribute that wealth to those they feel are deserving, which leads sort of to an exploration throughout the book of the gray area between right and wrong.
Absolutely, and I love that little bit of fable that's mixed into the realistic tale. And then kind of moving from that little bit of fable into full-on fantasy, Morgan, in A Resistance of Witches, it takes place during World War II, and it follows the journey of a British witch named Lydia, and she's hunting down a powerful grimoire. Why is it important that she locate that book of spells, and why are other powerful, venerable witches apathetic to her cause?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Lynne, so much for having me. I think I want to echo what Kristin said about, being excited to have fiction and nonfiction alongside each other. So the grimoire in this book, which is called the Grimorium Bellum, in Resistance of Witches, is this. Essentially, it's a weapon. It's an incredibly destructive power that the Nazis are also seeking. So Lydia's mission, while it is fantastical and magical, is at its heart a story about keeping a weapon of mass destruction out of Nazi hands. And as to the second part of your question about kind of the apathy that she gets from some of the other witches inside the academy, I think that there are multiple reasonings behind that. Some of these witches are still feeling that kind of sting of the witch trials and still feeling that oppression. Others are simply trying to bury their heads in the sand, wait it out. They're very much viewing the fate of witchkind and the fate of Britain as being separate from each other. Some of them even go so far as to kind of reveal their own personal prejudices, treating what happens to the victims of the Nazis as something that simply doesn't concern them. And I think I wanted to include all of those perspectives as a kind of nod to some appeasement style politics happening inside the walls of the Royal Academy of Witches, kind of pulling some of that historical political drama into what is essentially a fantastical story.
Thank you. And you mentioned things like there's oppression and like former injustices. And I want to think more about that for kind of our next category of topics of justice and injustice. And starting with Kristin, in The Stolen Life of Colette Marceau, one of the really delicious ironies in the book is that the book's Boston Center for Holocaust Education has been almost completely funded by the sale of jewels stolen from former Nazis and current neo-Nazis. How do you tackle this idea of reparations in the novel?
Well, first, let me say I read Morgan's book a few months ago, early for a blurb, and I think it was absolutely fabulous. It was like nothing I've ever read about World War II. I think it was such an inventive way to get into the heart of this story. So, Morgan, amazing job on that. I hope everyone gets to read it.
Thank you so much. It's so kind.
Oh, no, my gosh, of course. I loved it. So in terms of tackling the idea of reparations, I think I really liked the idea that, again, going back to that concept of what is right, what is wrong, what's the gray area in between. I really liked the idea that Colette justifies what she does and who she steals from based on the fact that she's rebalancing the scales of justice. But can you do that? Do we have the right to do that? can we decide on our own, these are the reparations that must be provided, and then provide them? Or are there other ways to go about that? So she lives a life that she feels is virtuous, but a lot of what she's driven by is guilt from her past and guilt over things that she blames herself for that happened 80 years ago. So it's just an interesting exploration of that. But I did like the delicious irony of jewels being stolen from Nazis and then used to fund a Holocaust center.
And I think it's important that you say too, like, is it even possible to balance, the scales from the past harms? And that's something that's talked about too, Lynne, in the Sisterhood of Ravensbruck, is some people were able to get reparations fairly easily from the German government, but there were others, especially the women who had been medically experimented upon. It was very arduous process for them to get those reparations. Can you talk a little bit more about the story behind those women and the process that it took to try and tip the scales?
Yeah, no, it's a great story. In Ravensbruck, it's all about Polish women in Ravensbruck. And at the camp, there were a large number of young Polish prisoners. Again, virtually all of them had been members of resistance groups in Poland. And Poland, by the way, I've written a couple of books that deal with Poland earlier, and Poland had by far the most active resistance organization in all of occupied Europe. There's no question. So these young girls were really, really brave. During the war, many of them, dozens of them, were used as guinea pigs in horrific medical experiments that ended up killing several of them and crippling most of the others for life. And the Polish women who didn't die were convinced that the Nazis were going to kill them too before the end of the war to cover up what they had done. And in fact, the Germans tried to do exactly that. The word went out in early February 1945 that the Polish women were about to be taken out and killed. And that led to one of the most incredible scenes in my book, which I will just describe very quickly. The entire camp came together to save these women, to prevent that from happening. And what's extraordinary is that they succeeded. The French women led the charge, and all the Poles survived. None of them were killed. I mean, this is in the middle of a Gestapo concentration camp. They were hidden by other camp inmates until the end of the war. But to get to your point, the question, after the war, the French survivors of Ravensbrück led another campaign. And this one was to demand reparations and recognition from the post-war German government for the Polish experiment victims. For a number of reasons, the West German government refused to do so for more than 10 years. But the French women and others who helped them were determined that the West German government not be allowed to get away with this. But as I said, it took more than a decade, but finally, thanks to a lot of people, the German government finally gave in, and the Poles were finally awarded both the recognition and the compensation for what they had suffered. Not nearly enough for what they had suffered, but at least the world finally acknowledged what had happened to them.
Yeah, that really was like one of the climaxes of your book was their story and that journey for getting that reparations, however much it ended up being. And then Morgan, you were talking about when we were a little bit discussing why some of the witches in your book were apathetic to the cause. You mentioned part of it was due to Europe's long history of murdering women who were assumed to be witches in the past. How does history of persecution play a role in your book?
Sure. I mean, some of this we touched on earlier, that hesitation that we see from the witches in the academy, that sense of, well, the British government has never helped us, so why on earth would we help them? But I think in a larger way, this is a story where all three point of view characters, Lydia, Henry, and Rebecca, have this experience of persecution in one way or another, and which I thought was a very important thing to include in a story that's set during World War II. So for instance, Henry is a Black man who was raised in the American South, so he's experienced kind of kind of that system of oppression. And then, of course, moving over to occupied France and experiencing a completely new sort of system of oppression, you know, a sort of out of the frying pan and into the fire. Rebecca, who is Jewish and living in secret in, you know, German occupied France. And then, of course, Lydia is a witch, which is a designation that once meant almost certain death in Europe. So all of these point of view characters, I think, are grappling with how to find and exert their own power inside a system of oppression that is seeking to keep them down, either through magical means, like what Lydia does, or through acts of very real political resistance, rather, like Henry helping to evacuate art from the Louvre, or Rebecca fighting in the French Resistance.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned systems of oppression, and Robert, that was something you addressed too in Remember Us, was that in addition to the war that people are fighting against Nazis, many of these soldiers and airmen in Remember Us also had to battle discrimination back home and amongst their ranks. Can you tell us about some of them?
I think you're referring to the fact that the graves at many of the cemeteries, the Netherlands American Cemetery, were dug by quartermaster troops who were Black Americans. And the government at the time was more comfortable, for the most part, having those soldiers have shovels rather than guns. It was a horrific job. There was no wood out there. All the boys were buried in mattress covers, and a very, very tactile job. But it's an important job, and it's axiomatic to war. You know, we're not talking about what happens if someone dies. When you have a war, you need fuel, you need ammunition, you need soldiers, and you need someone to bury the dead, and you need a place to do it. And our telling of World War II history in the United States has been largely, we were not engaged, we were attacked, we were behind, we caught up, we got engaged, we won, we came home, we moved on. And a large part of the story here with Remember Us is to change how Americans see Memorial Day, for them to understand what Memorial Day is and understand that the cost of freedom is paid for with the lives of others. And we should remember something about who they are. And I think the book goes to a fundamental truth about life, that everybody wants to be remembered somehow, some way, by somebody. And the Dutch have shown us a way of doing that by venerating the men and women that are buried there, but maintaining these relationships through this forever promise that was made, a promise made by a mother of 12, through whose experience I tell the story, who, when the United States government refused to provide the next of kin information for the families, this woman, this Dutch mayor's wife, flew to the United States and spent 5 weeks traveling around, staying in the homes of family members that had lost a boy or a girl overseas. And to all of them, she said, move on with your lives, leave your boys with us, we will watch over them like our own forever, hence the forever promise. And for 80 years, without interruption, unique again, not only to the United States overseas military cemeteries, but any cemetery we can even find anywhere in the world, these foreigners have venerated the Americans that are there. They take their kids and grandkids out there, and it's a more upbeat place because there's youthfulness, there's vivaciousness, and there is honor in the remembrance of who these men and women were and what they did.
Absolutely. And that is a form of justice too, in like the way that you remember those who fought. And so kind of thinking more about, we've talked a little bit about pursuit of justice. I want to go a little deeper into the war itself, both the war and how people resist during the war. So Morgan, in A Resistance of Witches, you alluded to how the Grimorium Bellum is this ultimate weapon of destruction, of mass destruction even. Like at one point, you mentioned it has magic so powerful, it can instantaneously level an entire city to ash, which is very much emblematic of atomic weaponry. How did you take these elements of World War II and then explore them through a fantasy setting?
Yeah, so I mean, you've really hit the nail on the head. Obviously the Grimorium Bellum was very intentionally written to be kind of an echo of the atomic bomb. I was interested in writing this destructive power that just by its sheer existence threatens all life, and kind of touching on this idea that a weapon of that scale isn't safe in anyone's hands, whether we think of them as an ally or an enemy. But in addition to that, there are a lot of, I think, other parallels and other kernels of stories that kind of made their way in. So for instance, Hitler and his inner circle had a very real fixation on the occult and on mythology, on fringe science. And Germany itself had this very rich history of stories about witches, of fairy tales. So combining those kinds of magical elements in a World War II setting felt very natural. And it also brought up questions of, if you have a character who sees ghosts, what is that experience like in a world where so many have died? What are the magical powers that would be the most useful in a spycraft setting? You have someone like Lydia who's using astral projection to collect military intelligence. You have her friend Kitty, who is a spy and uses glamour to change her face, something that's very much a witchcraft trope, but also I think very useful in this kind of adventure story. What would the British government do if, presented with an army of witches, and how would they choose to, use that power and distribute that information? How do you keep something like that a secret? I think for me, there is something very interesting about the connection between the World War II story and the fantasy story, in that they both have incredibly high stakes. I think fantasy stories, at least my favorite thing about fantasy stories, has always been that the stakes of the story are, there's this incredible evil that's going to devour the world, and our band of scrappy heroes has to do something about it. Well, in World War II, monsters really were trying to take over the world. It's just in this instance the monsters looked like men. So a madman really was trying to take over the world. Weapons that could destroy all life really did exist. And so I think that there's a very natural kind of marriage between fantasy and World War II.
Absolutely. And I think it's kind of like, as Kristin was saying too earlier, like that's why we're having both nonfiction and fiction and fantasy fiction represented here, because there's so many, it's just such a large concept of what happened. There's so many different ways in which to understand, whether it's the literal truths of what happened that we get through the nonfiction, or a lot more of those emotional truths that we can learn in a different way through our fictional novels. But going into more of the nonfiction side, so like Lynne, you were talking about earlier in Ravensbruck, when we were talking about, the way that the rabbits, as they were called, the women who were being experimented upon, they were able to be saved. And partly that was because as Ravensbruck grew past capacity, you said it became more and more difficult for the Germans to retain that complete oversight of the camp. So in what other ways did that lessening oversight allow for greater and diverse ways for resistance to occur?
Well, the French women I write about were involved in many, many acts of resistance throughout the months and the years they spent at Ravensbruck. But it did get more intense as the war went on, because the camp just metastasized in size. It was just huge. And I'll just give you examples of what they did. They did, first of all, the most important thing, and one of the most important things they did, is they did everything they could to avoid contributing to the German war effort. For example, like working in German munitions factories. Ravensbruck was known for providing labor to a number of factories and other German munitions kind of outfits all over Germany. Most of them were fairly close to Ravensbruck, but not always. So there was a great effort on the part of not only the French women, but a lot of other women not to do that. Those who were forced to do that did their best to commit acts of sabotage when they were actually working in the factories and other places. They also did other things like stealing supplies during work details, anything they could to thwart the Germans. And clearly, if they had been caught, they would have been executed right away. But as the camp, as you point out, became more crowded, a surprising number got away with what they were doing. And actually, it didn't become a game, but it became, something that they were absolutely determined to do. They considered themselves, they called themselves the Maquis of Ravensbruck. Maquis is a term used, it's a French term used to describe the young men who went into the bush, into the forest, to become resistance fighters. Well, they considered they were doing the same thing within the camp of Ravensbruck. And one of the most fascinating acts of resistance was nothing like what I've just been describing. It was committed by a woman named Germaine Tillion, who was one of the leaders of this French group. And she wrote a satirical musical review, complete with songs and dancing that made fun of the Nazis. I mean, you think, yeah, is that resistance? Of course it was. I mean, it was toward the end of the war, and it really didn't look like these women were going to be saved. And there was incredible despair. So she thought that she had to cheer them up. So that's what she did. And of course, it couldn't be staged in the camp. That would have been far too dangerous. And again, they all would have been killed if it had been found out. But she wrote down the review and the music, and they circulated copies of it throughout the camp to French-speaking inmates. So on their way to work details, they would sing songs from this review, and the lyrics were in French. So of course, the guards accompanying them, and often, were just kind of keeping in time with the music, had no idea they were being mocked and ridiculed in these songs. So it was just another way of resisting on their part, of making fun of what they called the monster.
Absolutely. And and as you say, there are so many different ways to resist. And I do love that operetta, that musical review you talked about, was then even later staged at multiple times way after the war and continues to have life.
It's still, I mean, this month, I think there are about 4 different productions in Paris.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So you mentioned stealing too, was one of the things they do a lot. So when I hear stealing, of course, I immediately think of Kristin and our dear Colette Marceau. Because one of the ways we talked about how she steals jewels and that helps fund current Holocaust education efforts, but also during the World War II sections of your book, her thievery and her mother's thievery also helps fund resistance groups. And, most of us are probably like, stealing is wrong, but it's kind of hard to disagree with her motives. How do different perspectives on her family's credo and the moral absolutism of whether stealing is okay affect the relationships of Colette's life?
Well, that's a great question. And kind of to go off of what Lynne was saying, there are different ways to resist, right? I mean, we can all resist in our own ways, but I think we all resist with our own skill sets too. So during World War II, I've written about, in the Book of Lost Names, I've written about forgers who resist by forging documents for people. We can all agree that forgery is illegal, but if they had not forged documents for people trying to escape, those people would have lost their lives. So how can we say that that was wrong? I wrote in The Winemaker's Wife about people hiding and smuggling arms through champagne caves. That is not legal. You can't smuggle arms. But if they hadn't done that, they wouldn't have been able to arm the resistance fighters. So I think, in times of crisis, in times of very dire circumstances, people stepped up to use their talents to try to do the right thing, even if it was illegal. So during the war, I think it's a little bit easier to justify what Colette was doing. And certainly that's based on reality too. There were people who stole to fund the resistance, to fund movements, to help, pay for the supplies and help to bribe people and all of these things that they needed money for. But then the question becomes, what about when the war is over? What about when it's no longer a battle of good versus evil on this large scale, and you're battling evil on your own small scale and sort of your own smaller theater? So to your question, Justin, I think it does affect her relationships deeply, because the people in her life, some of them understand what she's doing. Some of them are very on board with what she's doing, such as her lifelong friend, Marty, who's her jewel broker. But then that's another gray area, because Marty's not just supporting the goodness that she's doing. He's taking a nice little percentage of the jewels that he sells for her. So, the argument can be made that perhaps Marty is a little bit more on the side of wrong than Colette is, because Colette doesn't profit from any of this. But it really brings things to a head when Aviva, who she considers a daughter, the closest person to her in the world, discovers what she has been doing, and she has to justify this to somebody who's an attorney who's lived her entire life by a very strict code of this is right, this is wrong, this is legal, this is illegal. And now the person she loves most in the world is saying, this is what I've been doing for 80 years.
Thank you. And it was really touching, those moments where she would sit people down and be like, there's a part of myself, I have to tell you, knowing like this could implode the entire relationship, but is also who she is. And I think that was a really beautiful job you did with that.
You. Thanks.
And so thinking about like, we've been talking about there's a lot of different ways to resist, to fight. And of course, in Remember Us, there's a lot of military resistance that is occurring, like official government sanctioned military fighting against the Nazis. But there's also a lot of subtle acts of resistance as well. And one of my favorites that you had in there, Robert, was when this Nazi commandant, he's visiting a cave that's filled with priceless art, and he wants to consider, could we store munitions there? And then the guy just kind of takes him through the most perilous trek through there to disabuse him of that notion. Can you tell us more about that story and its significance? It was one of my favorite moments.
Well, the resistance is, I mean, that's misleading in the sense that combat soldiers aren't resisting. They're fighting the people that are resisting them recovering freedom. But it is true that there were a number of more than we could count, but some key figures in the book that went to extraordinary life-risking efforts to shelter Jews, shelter downed Allied pilots. And one of the two key figures in the book are women, one of whom I knew for 8 years before she died several years ago, and I delivered her eulogy. She was 15 when the Nazis invaded the country, 19 when the Americans liberated it. And the other was this mother of 12 who died in 1970, but I'm quite good friends with her daughter, her oldest daughter, who's 92. And she helped me tell the story from the grave because she had these memory books that recorded largely everything that happened over the course of her whole life and her children's lives. The young girl's father, Dave Van Skyke, was the pioneer of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is a series of caves that's actually the second largest bat habitat in the world. They were growing mushrooms in portions of the cave. They used it as a place of safekeeping to get away from bombing, Allied and mostly the Nazis. But there was a moment that the great museums in Amsterdam, the Rijksmuseum in particular, evacuated their works of art to keep them safe with the fear that Allied bombing would target cities. That did not happen in Europe. There were incidences. They moved them to various places throughout the war until 1942, when they moved them to this series of caves in St. Petersburg, including Rembrandt's Night Watch, certainly the most important and famous painting in the Netherlands and one of the 10 most important paintings in the world. It was rolled up like a carpet on a spindle, and these works were moved in the dead of night. So this fellow, Dave Van Skyke, who had mapped the mountain and knew the secret hiding places to pass Jews and pilots safely through from Netherlands to Belgium, was in charge of setting up the temperature control system there. And when the Nazi commandant visited this cave one day, wanting to look at these works of art, he was frustrated because there was an indigent, an insolent Dutch guard there who refused to allow him in because he had his pistol on, and that was against the rules. Well, of course, the guy could have pulled his gun out and shot him, but he didn't. And the guard stood his ground, and then he wanted to see the caves. And Dave Van Skyke had an impression that what the motivation here was partly to see the works of art and consider a day when they would take them the rest of the direction into Germany. They hadn't been stolen yet, but more so perhaps use the mine or the tunnel, the caves rather, as a place for German munitions. And Dave did not want to have that happen, partly out of understanding that's not a good thing for Maastricht in the area, but largely these caves were his hobby, his passion, and he didn't want to see them damaged. So he decided to give a tour to this German commandant, and Dave knew the caves so well, caves that people were killed in all the time because they got lost and it was pitch dark, or portions of this marl, this Austin chalk, would collapse. There was water and there were weak areas. He could tell which areas, he knew which areas were like that from the water infiltration, just from the sounds of the movement of the stone, and walked this Nazi commandant through on a deliberate circuitous route. And of course, the guy had no idea. He was walking him in circles, but where he was taking him was the roof, the ceiling of the caves were collapsing. They were walking through water, and the guy was scared to death. And finally, at some point in time, said, "I've had enough. I want out of this place." So it was a really clever way of putting the Nazis off. And in fact, they left the tunnel alone. They found other caves in different part of the province that they used to hide munitions. So it was a very courageous thing that he did, on top of courageous things all the time, just trying to save the lives of innocent people.
Absolutely. And then for many people, like, that is going to be, especially because you've written about and recounted that tale, like, that is now like one of that man's big legacies, is preventing that, but also possibly even saving tons of artwork. And so for the last section, I want to reflect a little bit on that legacy, both in terms of what happened after the war, but also the impact that we leave from generation to generation. And so for Lynne, I want to start with you. When I was reading The Sisterhood of Ravensbruck, honestly, I was surprised. I did not know this, that French women only received the right to vote in 1944. And that was in large part due to their role in resisting the Germans, even if they weren't really recognized for it, but that's another issue. But what was life like for many of these women after Ravensbruck's liberation?
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to talk about, just in general, the women in the French resistance. It's important to remember that women were the lifeblood of the French resistance. You would not get that idea if you read the histories, particularly early histories of the resistance, but it's true. They did everything that men did and more. They helped create some of the earliest resistance networks in France. They collected intelligence, they set up escape lines, they worked as couriers, they transported weapons. The resistance couldn't have survived without women, but you'd never know it, after the war. After the war, men took all the credit and women were treated as an afterthought. The French public was encouraged to believe by General Charles de Gaulle and male resistance leaders that the resistance was entirely a male undertaking. And that's even considering the fact that one of my main characters in this book, I have 4 women that I focus on, is Charles de Gaulle's niece, who was as brave in her own way as her uncle was. But she didn't get much. He loved her dearly, but she didn't get much mention from him. These men said the same things about members of the resistance who had been caught by the Gestapo and sent to prisons and concentration camps. With a few exceptions, the experiences of women in those camps were excluded from histories of the period. The emphasis again was on the men. But the women survivors of Ravensbruck refused to put up with such treatment. They had taken the same risks as men. They had suffered the same brutal punishments, and they were determined to get the same rights and the same recognition that they had legitimately earned. So to make sure this happened, they formed an all-female activist organization of concentration camp survivors, only women concentration camp survivors after the war. And so even though French women were given the right to vote in 1944, and as you make clear, 1944? I mean, my goodness. And it was because the women had been so active in the resistance. France, as you probably can guess, was still a conservative, patriarchal society. And women were still considered second-class citizens, despite this, subject to the authority of their fathers and husbands, or whatever male was in their world. So by asserting their authority, the women of Ravensbruck became, in effect, revolutionaries. They really did. Demanding the right to take charge of their own lives. And they continued to do that. I mean, it's amazing. The 4 women that I write about were all, I guess if you survive the war in a concentration camp, you're probably very hardy. And they all lived, the shortest lived was in her late 80s when she died. So they lived very long lives. And in the course of those very long lives, they did not give up their fight for freedom and justice. They continued it until the end of their lives. And as a result, of that, of what they had done in the war. 10 years ago this month, there were several new additions made to the French Pantheon. The French Pantheon is the France's kind of monument to the great men of France. That's where they're buried. And only in 2015, only 71 people had been honored that way. One woman, Marie Curie. And in 2015, 2 more women were added to that august group. And 2 of them are 2 of the women I write about in Sisterhood, Ravensbruck.
Thank you. And then so also like thinking about like, you know, so much of history is like whose story is told and how we tell it. Robert, I know for your book, you spent almost 8 years researching Remember Us. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research process that went into how you preserved so many people's legacies?
Well, you check into an insane society to start with for 8 years. You know, my work is really less author than messenger. And it was that way on Monuments Men. And it's that way here. Both of these stories found me. I didn't find them. Monuments Men was driven by the most altruistic and remarkable break with civilization, that for the first time in war, a conquering army returned millions of stolen objects to the people from whom they'd been stolen. That had never happened before. And it confers great dignity on the United States and the leadership of General Marshall and General Eisenhower and these men and women that did it. And I wanted their story to be known. I wanted them to be thanked. I wanted their legacy to be preserved. I wanted our country to do better in future conflicts than we did in Iraq in 2003. And I wanted a film to share their story with everybody in the world so we would do better and know about it. And we got that done. I'm not happy with what happens on Memorial Day in the United States and the amount of ignorance about why we have Memorial Day. I'm very bothered by how many Americans don't understand that freedom costs something, and the people that go get it for us pay for it with their lives. And the Dutch have never been thanked for this remarkable thing that they've done over the last 80 years in honoring their liberators. So when I was introduced to this woman, Frida is her name, who I knew for 8 years, and she asked me, had I been to the cemetery? And I said, yes. And she said, well, you know about the grave adoption program? And I was embarrassed. I did not. I'd never heard of it. And I thought, well, there's a story that seems impossible that we don't know about that, along with what are the mechanics of what happens when a soldier's killed? How do they get into a cemetery? Who goes and picks them up off the battlefield? What do they do with the body? It's a car wreck of an element of war, but we never tell it because it's depressing. Well, it's set against the backdrop of this remarkable moment of humanity and civility on the part of the Dutch. It's part of a much bigger picture and a very, very beautiful ending. I mean, we all know there's death in war, so I'm not introducing that as a concept. So I think that's it. The key here is to understand there's a bigger picture in telling the story, and that is to try and change how we Americans no longer do the very things that the Dutch do, which is go out and honor and remember the American men and women who not only brought freedom to the Netherlands and Europe and the world, but even today make sure that the country we live in is safe.
Absolutely. And when you talk about remembering and honoring and thanking too, Morgan, one of the things I thought was really touching was in the acknowledgments of A Resistance of Witches, you write, this is a story about mothers. And you say that your mother taught you what it means to live a creative life. So how do you explore the bonds of motherhood in this book? And in any way, was it inspired by y'all's relationship?
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, but only in that I think there is something really universal about this struggle of growing up and growing away from your own mother, even when the mother that you have happens to be remarkable. And I was gifted with a very remarkable mother. My mom is actually also an author. And so, you know, growing up, I was able to be exposed to not only my mother, but also my aunt, who is a novelist, and all of my mother's friends who were novelists, and really got to have modeled for me that there is a life you can build where you are both professionally and creatively fulfilled. You know, I was never pressured to get a desk job. I was never pressured to, you know, major in something safe in college. I got a theater degree. You know, I always felt very creatively supported. And I think it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized just how unusual that is and just how extraordinary that is to be able to see your own parent as someone who is a creative force all their own. But I also think that there is a period of your life, somewhere around 18, 19, 20, around the age that Lydia is, where no matter how cool your mom is, you kind of want to go do your own thing. You need to create some physical and psychological distance in order to become your own person. And I think, you know, the way you see that with Lydia is, you know, her mother, Evelyn, is, I think, maybe my favorite character in the book, but she's this hedge witch. She's kind of messy. She's a little eccentric. And Lydia really pulls away from her in favor of the kind of more buttoned up mentorship of the women at the academy who take on their own kind of surrogate mother role for Lydia. You also have Henry, who creates not only physical but spiritual distance between himself and his mother, because, you know, her world in New Orleans is not safe for someone with his kind of gifts. And then you have Rebecca's story, which very much is about that kind of grief that, you know, most of us will experience of having to move forward without our mother, and the guilt of having to carry on her life without her. So I think as much as this is a story about, you know, magic and World War II and all of those things, I think the real arc for each of these characters is growing into yourself enough to be able to go back to your mom and say, wow, I actually really see you, and can relate to you in a way that maybe I couldn't when I was a moody adolescent.
Right. And then thinking about now how things are literally passed down, Kristin, a lot of the action of the stolen life of Colette Marceau is put into motion when the companion piece to this unique bracelet resurfaces after almost 80 years. And I don't, you know, I'm not asking you to give too many secrets away, but can you talk a little bit about the way in which family legacy is explored through heirlooms?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know we are running short on time, so I will keep it concise and quick. I think that the things we carry with us remind us of our past. And I think when we carry things with us, when we carry the past in our hearts, it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. I think we sometimes carry responsibility that isn't necessarily ours to carry or burdens that aren't ours to share. But I think we also carry forward traditions and carry forward things we've learned. You know, Lynne mentioned the survivors of Ravensbruck doing things that changed France afterwards, that changed things for the better for the future. Robert mentioned this amazing thing where people remembered these soldiers who liberated them. Morgan, you talked about, you know, the legacy of breaking free of your parents and kind of having to get away from them sometimes before you go back because you have to figure out who you are. So I think the past shapes us, and I think that's one of the fascinating things about what all of us do, writing about the past, because it doesn't stop on the final page of a book about the past. The past follows us forward into the future, and I think it shapes who we are today.
Absolutely. And thank you all so much to our speakers for writing your amazing books and for speaking about them here and for sharing them out into the world. And thanks to all the librarians and everyone else who's tuning into this talk. Next up, y'all are going to have a short break, so make sure to visit the exhibit hall to chat with reps and download free resources. Have a wonderful day, everyone.